integrating monitoring and evaluation. I think there's a couple of things that we're going to look at today.
We'll look at some basic statutory requirements for monitoring when we're delivering retrofit projects. We're going to have a little chat around measuring measurable intended outcomes. And then we'll have a look at some general monitoring and evaluation, and then how you can include approaches to questionnaires as part of that monitoring and evaluation process. So, basic statutory requirements. You have to comply with the PAS 2035 under a government-funded retrofit programme. As we move forward now from, well, it'll be from next year, but there's a process of transition underway, transitioning from PAS 2035 2019 to PAS 2035 2023. And you'll need to transition to using the 2023 approach by the beginning of April next year. But within that, within the PAS, is this element here around understanding, monitoring, evaluation, and intended outcomes. So the retrofit project is subject to monitoring and evaluation, determine whether the intended outcomes of the retrofit project have been realised, and to identify and to learn from any project-specific or systematic problems with the retrofit risk assessment, the dwelling assessment, the retrofit design, the installation, or the testing, commissioning, or handover of energy efficiency measures. So that covers essentially pretty much the whole of the customer journey or the retrofit journey that you look at. So sort of starting with, was there an issue with the risk assessment? Was there an issue with the dwelling assessment? Did we have the wrong information? Was it the retrofit design that wasn't appropriate? Was it the installation of the energy efficiency measures that wasn't done well enough? There was no, perhaps the commissioning wasn't done, or the testing wasn't done correctly, and or the handover wasn't a very good approach. Historically, there have been some areas where these have been challenging. The dwelling assessments have often been of varying quality. So sometimes you'll get an inappropriate dwelling assessment because people haven't checked the housing type, and you might have a wrong wall type. If that's the case and no one goes back and checks it, you could end up having an incorrect retrofit design. Hopefully most of the retrofit designs are focused on properties that need some more significant elements rather than sort of more simple measures like loft and cavity wall insulation. Also, you know, retrofit design didn't really exist outside of suppliers and contractors for many at mass, at scale retrofit projects until the introduction of PAS. And then the installation of energy efficiency measures has also had a rocky road. And I think we're still on a learning curve with some contractors. The quality of work has improved as a result of the upgrades for the PAS 2035, but it's still worth noting that things can go wrong. They do go wrong, so it's really helpful to check in the process. Sometimes things don't get commissioned properly. So do they run a test? Is it focused for the particular property or the people that are in that property? And then handover is making sure that the residents in the property know what's been installed and how to use it, what to do if something goes wrong. You know, do I press this red button? Is that going to explode the thing? All that type of stuff. So again, we're going to cover most of these things here today. So under the PAS, there are a couple of levels of monitoring. There's a statutory minimum. So the basic monitoring and evaluation shall be applied to every completed domestic retrofit project, irrespective of the level of risk assessed under clause 8. So this normally applies to having a survey with the resident to see how they've taken on board the retrofit projects, to see whether they understand it and to see how they feel about it. When that's your basic minimum level, really. If there are any issues with how the property is performing after a month or so of running the project, it does also depend what you've installed and at what time of year as to how quickly that comes around. It's worth noting that you might identify that it's not performing as you'd anticipated, and it might be worth going on to do a different type of monitoring regime. So the next monitoring regime, called the intermediate, should be applied for projects which are require significantly different approaches or have more difficult approaches to how they're retrofitted. So, or where things aren't working as anticipated. So if we put in a, let's say, air source heat pump, and the resident isn't feeling the benefit of the heat pump, it might be worth coming down, getting the heat pump engineer out to have a look to make sure it's been commissioned correctly, that the resident knows how to use it, that they understand that it is a lower heat temperature than their perhaps gas or oil-based boiler, and running through those. When you go on to things like whether insulation is working, you might want to take a different approach. But I think it's worth considering that the more complicated your retrofit project becomes, so the more it moves towards a whole house retrofit, or it's a hard to treat property, so it might have a traditional construction approach, the more you're going to have an intermediate or above type monitoring regime. And as I said, if things don't go as according to plan, then you need to understand why things are going wrong, and then you'll have to have another monitoring regime put in place. So if we only did the customer survey in the first instance, when it's not working, we'd want to put in perhaps 3 months of monitoring to see how things are going. So what you might want to do is have a look at monitoring your energy use, looking at the time and day that the air source heat pump is on, maybe putting in some data loggers to measure the internal temperature of the property. Okay, so measurable intended outcomes. I think it's really important that we consider this at the beginning of any retrofit project. So monitoring and evaluation should not be left until the end of a project and then an afterthought at that point. It really needs to form the basis of the beginning of your project. What are you trying to achieve with your retrofit project for your residents? Yeah, you're all probably trying to get to EPC if it's a statutory requirement, but as on top of that, you might be wanting to have specific outcomes. So you might be wanting to achieve a minimum temperature or maximum temperature, probably not a maximum temperature, maybe if you're looking at overheating risk. But you're wanting to have a look at different ways that you can monitor the success of your retrofit project. If you think about it at the beginning, you can then put in place the right monitoring regime to collect the information so you can understand whether you've been successful or not. And on this slide, we can see that there are a number of different approaches that we can think about. So one of the primary outcomes that we want to achieve is reduced fuel use or elimination of fuel poverty. Hopefully they are both the same, but not always. So we might want to reduce fuel use in order to reduce emissions as an emissions factor for CO2 and other climate emissions, or we might be looking at saving costs for residents and taking them out of fuel poverty. We probably want to improve comfort for a lot of our residents. So they might have a heating system that works, but because the house isn't very energy efficient, they can't afford to keep the heating system on for very long. So having a house that's been insulated may mean that they then can use the heating system that's there and get to an adequate level of comfort. So you may have something where a resident doesn't achieve a saving in their energy bills, but actually has an improvement only in their comfort. And if that's one of the outcomes, then that's a good approach to take. One of the really important things we're looking at is reducing mold and condensation issues. There are ways of measuring this, but fundamentally, if you take the right approach towards retrofit, which is increasing the insulation and thermal capacity of the building, applying heating that's affordable to use, and having good indoor air quality, you will reduce issues of condensation and mold growth. Next one is, again, indoor air quality, improving that. And then another one, which we quite often don't think about, but is actually going to be more and more important as we move forward, is considering summertime overheating risk. So there are things that you can do from a retrofit point of view that would increase the potential for summertime overheating. Internal wall insulation can be one of those things. Double glazing, not putting ventilation in, not having adequate cross ventilation, all of those sorts of things can lead to increased risks of overheating. And generally speaking, an overheating risk is something like 3 days at a temperature of 27 degrees or above, but that can differ depending on your residents and their health conditions. So let's move on. So looking at some basic monitoring and evaluation. So some of the things that you might want to agree at this stage is conversations with your resident and the occupants to understand whether the intended outcomes have been achieved. So that's why it's good to understand that from the beginning. They might not know what the intended outcomes are, but you should. So having those conversations and trying to elicit information from them is the way that you'll answer that question. Understanding if there have been any unintended consequences of the work that's happened. So this can happen, as I said, one of the classic ones is you have improvements to reduce heat demand in the winter, but it could lead to an increase in overheating in the summer. So that would be an unintended consequence. I'd say now that shouldn't be an unintended consequence. We should understand from a design perspective that is a potential consequence and it should be designed out at the initial design stage. Are your occupants, your clients, are they happy, satisfied with the outcomes of the work that's done on your house, on their house? This is really important, and this is quite subjective, and it is sometimes something that your initial handover might not score particularly well, but if you went back 3-6 months later and asked them again, they may have a different view. It really does depend sometimes on the complexity of the work and how disruptive it was for them to live through and how long it's taken. And I've worked on some energy storm projects where they've taken 6 months to complete. I mean, they were done in COVID, so they probably took longer than they needed to because of that. But the residents were obviously really quite upset about the length of time that they had people in their house because it was a whole house retrofit. It was incredibly disruptive to them inside and outside. And they were very unhappy with the whole process. But when you went back a year later and you asked them how their homes were and how they were performing, they were really positive about the outcomes of their properties. So I think it's really important to understand that there is always a journey. And if you ask people at a certain point, they might give you a response that's quite different to when they've lived with it for a while and then they've forgotten about how awful it was to have blokes with size 12 feet marching around their house all day. I don't know if they had size 12 feet, but anyway. So that's a really important one. And then you need to identify any specific points of dissatisfaction. And I think it's really important to note here that it could be that something's not working properly. It could be that you've actually specified a controls unit that's really difficult for perhaps somebody with mobility issues, poor eyesight, an elderly person to use. So they just find it really difficult and they don't change things. So that might be a problem around that. So it's always, again, worth, if you do this monitoring and you get this sort of feedback, it makes you think about how can I change that for a future project. And it might obviously be some other things. They might just want to moan about how annoying the installation process was. And I think it's fair enough to accept that because we can also work with our contractors to see if we can improve the process of installation. It's an uphill struggle a bit because there is always going to be disruption when we do any kind of building works, but it can be that we can focus on particular areas, and it might be that identifies some issues perhaps with the contractors that we're working with that might not come to light if we don't know about it. Are the client and occupant satisfied with the process of assessment, design, installation, testing, commissioning, and handover of retrofit measures? So there's a lot in that. And we probably wouldn't want to ask a resident, unless it was a face-to-face conversation, about every single process in there. But what we would want to know is how they found the process of from beginning to end for them. Are there any processes that they think they didn't need, and why? Are there any processes that they think didn't go particularly well? And I think it's really important at this stage, when we're doing that kind of questioning of residents, to put ourselves as social housing providers or project delivery people into that position of, is there anything we could have done better to help you on that process as well? So it's not just working with external contractors and their performance, it's us as a team, as a retrofit team, and it includes everybody involved in that. Identification of any elements of the installation that are not working as expected. So that could just be that, well, here's an example. You could have a ventilation system that the resident feels is not really working as they thought it would. And I'm going to give an example. It's not social housing, it's a private housing property. A friend bought a passive house building. They had an MVHR, mechanical ventilation heat recovery ventilation system. And they felt it was really quite cold in their house, and they couldn't quite understand why it was. They eventually managed to get the builder out on an inspection, and whoever had installed it had put all the extract into one house and all the intake into another house. So one house was really quite cold and one house was really quite stuffy, and it wasn't working as it had intended. So, I mean, it's quite an extreme example, but it's a really good one to illustrate a point that something isn't working as it was expected. And then, any other comments that a resident might want to make in terms of their whole experience. Quite often they don't really say anything, they just don't want to answer, but it's worth giving them the opportunity to do that. So on this slide, we're going to have a look at some things that you might want to measure in your monitoring and evaluation process. So these are going to be split into qualitative and quantitative, and as you can see, they're target metrics, means of measurement, location if it's necessary, for how long you might want to do it, and who might do that data collection. So under qualitative, we've got comfort, perceived energy savings, and retrofit outcomes evaluation. So this is something you could do from a general occupant feedback survey. And you could ask them things about, does their house feel warmer than it used to be? Do they feel more comfort? Are there areas of the house that feel warmer or colder than before? You could ask them to tell you if they feel like they've saved money, and obviously ask them whether they are happy with the outcome. Alongside that, you could actually have a look at fuel bills and measure their fuel bills if you can get access to them, and that would enable you to tell whether they've had a reduction in their energy use, or it stayed the same, or possibly even increased. And again, you need to understand the starting position to know whether that's a good outcome or not, because if we go back to the taking comfort, it may be that somebody lived in a house that wasn't very warm. They didn't really use their heating because they just felt like they were burning through money and it wasn't making a difference to the house that they were living in. You go and do some refurbishment, retrofit works, you've made that house more energy efficient, they can now afford to put their heating on. So actually their bills have gone up because they weren't really using it previously. So we need to consider that within the whole round, and not just kind of think about, oh my God, that the heating bills have gone up. Why is that? And I think it's really worth having questions within a survey that say, have you changed how you heat your house? Have your heating patterns changed? So, they are useful questions to ask if you want this level of detail. We've talked about this a little bit, the disruption and process, the impact that it's taken. Again, this is done as a survey. You can do this individual occupant surveys, you could do focus groups, and you could do some in-depth reviews. It really depends on how much information you want and what the outcome would be. I would say that if you were doing an occupant survey, ideally you would get your retrofit coordinator to do that as part of the end of project survey, the monitoring and evaluation element. They will have some predetermined questions that they want to ask, and you may just want to ask a few more on top of that. Probably always want to keep it below 10 questions because people do lose interest. The shorter you can make it, the better, but you need to weigh that up with what sort of information you're trying to get from them. Okay, and then we'll move on to some airtightness quantitative areas to monitor and evaluate. So one of the things that you might want to look at is airtightness. So one of the reasons why we want to reduce drafts is because drafts make us feel cold. So improving airtightness will help with that. It also helps with heat loss. So you can undertake airtightness testing, particularly if you're trying to achieve a specific outcome from that. There is a blower door test that you can do, and that's the details are there. And what you do that is you do that pre-installation of anything, so you can test how air permeable, how many air changes an hour you would get with that building, and then you do your retrofit elements. Before you do all your finishing, you would then do another air changing just to see how it performed. And that, I say that do before finishing, because if you've finished everything and then you do another air pressure test, what will happen if it's not achieving the outcome that you have is that you'll have to undo all that finishing to try and work out where there's air loss through joints between probably windows, doors, walls and ceilings, and walls and floors. So if you haven't finished off, it gives you an opportunity to return, have a look at the areas where you might want to detail a bit more tightly around there, and then you can do your finishing. So one of the things you can do when you've got an air pressure testing, air tightness testing, is you do that, and if it's not achieving the outcome that you want, you can do a smoke test. So you would have a little smoke producing element, and then you'd run the air pressure test, and it would identify where the smoke is going, and that's where you're having the heat loss generally. So they are normally carried out by specialists, so it's not something you'd normally do unless you had the qualifications to do so. Okay, some more quantitative. So internal temperatures is a really good one to try and achieve. These are recommended, I think, by CIBSE, so 18 to 21 degrees in living spaces and 16 degrees in bedrooms. Depending on your residents, you might want to try and increase that if they have particular issues that might impact them. But these are the kind of minimum standards, 18 and 16. And how you can measure those is to put in data loggers in specific rooms. So they're just a tiny little thing that go on a shelf somewhere, or you could stick them to the wall or the ceiling, and it measures your heat in that building. They're normally a digital connection, and they'll log intervals, heat intervals at specific times, however regularly you want to do. Normally you would probably do a minimum of half hourly, maybe upwards to an hour. So you get an idea what that looks like. And then you can have them in situ, just sitting there. As long as they've got enough charge and they're getting that connection, you can actually run the information in real time in a lot of instances. So a lot of these new services that you can get, these digital systems that will do something like this, will have a temperature check with them. You can also have to have them just sat there, and then someone can come along and pick them up, take them off, plug them into the computer, download the information and check them. But they're a fairly simple way of understanding the temperatures that you're achieving. I think it's also important to note that where you locate the data loggers is going to affect the outcome you get, bearing in mind that heat rises, bearing in mind that you've got different solar gain in different parts of the house, so east, south, west and north. So just thinking about those type of things will potentially impact the results that you get. It's sometimes people put them outside as well in a shaded location to give a comparison of the external temperatures. You can actually get the external temperature information off of a data set, but that would give you a comparative understanding in the exact location you're in, because the data sets you can get online, they're not everywhere. So it'll be to your nearest data point that you can get that information. Okay, and then we've got calculating heat energy demand. For SHDF, we've got this 90 kilowatts per hour per meter squared per annum as a recommended target, which will give you generally on most properties an EPC rating. It doesn't on all properties, so it's not a guarantee that you're going to get an EPC certificate at the end of it, but it does give you a reasonable marker of a property that can be heated and comfortable to live in. So these can be clamps that are put on submeters and heat meters, and you can take the information from those and get an understanding. You can also do a heat calculation, an HTC, I think it is. But it's useful to understand that if you are trying to achieve a specific heat demand outcome. When we worked on the energy sprung projects, they were trying to get a very low heat demand outcome below 35 kilowatts. So it's really important that we have an opportunity to measure that and understand what the outcome is to see whether we've achieved it. Okay. So moving on to the final section. So when we're having a look at questions, so you want to think about the people that you're asking questions of and what type of language that you use to ask the question. So as we can see here, you've got, are you getting the correct efficiency out of your heat pump? I mean, do they know what the correct efficiency is? How would they check that they're getting the correct efficiency? So there's a bit of a meaningless question for them. But the one underneath, do you feel you're benefiting from your new heat pump, has a lot more meaning to that resident. And then you want to have a look at the how you might respond to that. So you might want to do a Likert scale questionnaire. So that's normally the questions where you get a 5 or 7 point scale, which is centered around a neutral. So the neutral is normally, I don't know. And then you'd have a good, very good, optimized or exceptional, or like poor, terrible, I don't want to talk to you, you're awful. That you wouldn't use those terms, but what you normally do is have those kind of exactly the same kind of markers either side of that neutral in the middle, and you give people a question of answering, you know, tick the box. Or you might have on a scale of 1 to 5, where do you feel this meets it? And normally where 1 is very poor and 5 is very good, something along those lines. So yeah, you want to do simple, non-technical language wherever possible, short, simple and direct. And either you're looking for an open-ended question, if you're leaving it as an open box, rather than a closed one where they go yes or no, because that's not very helpful unless you specifically want a binary response from it. Or you're looking to have something where you've got that sort of scale, so you can kind of understand where people fit overall. Because, you know, did this meet your expectations as a binary yes, no, isn't very helpful. Even if you get something helpful out of the end of it, what you really want to know is how well are we performing towards that? And the more nuanced you get towards that, the better, because it helps you identify where you can improve. Right, I think this is the final slide. This is the Likert scale. Here we've got a 7-point scale. So we've got neither satisfied or dissatisfied. And then you have very satisfied down to very dissatisfied, and that gives you that kind of equal balance. So that is the end of the presentation, but I did want to just kind of flag that, you know, sometimes monitoring and evaluation is considered a requirement to meet the requirements of the funding. But I would encourage people to think about what monitoring and evaluation you can do to understand how successful your project is, and the outcomes of your project and whether you're achieving them, and how you can improve that for future projects. So I'm not saying that you should necessarily do very detailed monitoring on every single property that you retrofit. You certainly want to do those basic questions around it, but you might want to take a nuanced approach of saying, if you've got some similar archetypes, maybe doing some actual in situ monitoring with data loggers for temperature, or those air pressure testing, that type of activity. So, and then doing an analysis of it at the end before you move on to do something else. It's a really good way of seeing if the work that your contractors are doing is making an impact, and helping to identify if there are any particular issues in that.